Hello everybody, welcome to Cocktails, Controversy and Conservation. My name's Chris Gambian, I'm the Chief Executive of the Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales, and welcome to the episode I think that everybody has been waiting for, Burning Questions, everything you've ever wanted to know about the bushfires ahead of our Bushfire Conference in a couple of weeks' time. Jackie Mumford, look at this.
Chris, I know.
It's
Where
insane.
are we?
What is going on?
I'm not in my office at home. I'm not in my lounge room. I don't know what to do with myself.
We've hit the big time. This is our brand new set that Peter in our office has pulled together. But it is very much the NCC office, which is why it looks a little bit like Wayne's World.
It's not a cocktail bar, evidently.
And just for people who are a bit concerned, because we've had letters, this is a gin and tonic. It's not a glass of water. And I can assure you that all of our guests are properly liquored up for tonight's episode.
I know, you could have fooled me, Chris. I thought I had a glass of water here, but it is in fact putting the cocktails in Cocktails, Controversy and Conservation.
We should meet our guests.
We should, yes. Tonight we're very lucky to be joined by three of Australia's leading experts on bushfire and climate change. We have Greg Mullins, former Fire and Rescue Commissioner of New South Wales and current member of the Rural Fire Service. Professor Ross Bradstock, former director of the Centre for Environmental Risk Management of Bushfires, and of course Professor Leslie Hughes, distinguished professor of biology at Macquarie University and councillor in the Climate Council. Welcome, thanks for being here.
Thank you. In September of 2019, I'd only just barely started at the Nature Conservation Council. Fires broke out in the north coast of New South Wales, and little did we know at that point that over the course of the next 6 months we would see the worst fires really that human history has ever recorded here in New South Wales and the rest of Australia. At the time we heard lots of rhetoric from our political leaders. The Prime Minister told us he didn't hold a hose and he went on holidays to Hawaii. The Deputy Premier of New South Wales told us that talking about climate change around the time of the bushfire, while there was a bushfire emergency going on, was not in fact the right thing to do. The Deputy Prime Minister chimed in on that as well. And we heard an awful lot about how the Greenies were to blame for the fires, and having only just started working at the Nature Conservation Council, I was very surprised to learn that I had in fact been solely responsible for starting all of the fires here in New South Wales. Steve Price, you might remember him. He used to be a shock jock on the radio. He's lost his job since then. But he had a go at our Jackie Mumford for holding
not being out there on the front line fighting fires.
Fighting the fires himself.
But for wanting
herself.
myself. But instead wanting to address the root cause of why our bushfire seasons are getting longer and hotter.
And a couple of days later, I went on the radio and was interviewed, so-called, by Steve. But he was decent enough to give us some time on his program. And one of the things he had to say was this.
Since 1955, we have driven the expansion of the state's national park system. Now, the problem with that is we've locked up vast tracts of land as national parks because you've campaigned for them and no one maintains them. Fire roars out of those joints straight through people's farms. It's 1955.
So, my first question for the panel, are the Greenies to blame? Is this the fault of national parks?
Can I look? So the facts of the matter, and this has been fact-checked to death. Greens doesn't hold power anywhere, so they don't write legislation or regulations or stop people burning. National Parks and Wildlife have been doing more burning than in previous years, and what they were trying to avoid was the fact that it was the hottest, driest year ever, and we had fire danger indexes, so the fire weather was just horrendous, and it drove fires that we've never seen before. And I was out fighting those fires. I've been doing this for 50 years now. I've never seen anything like it. So it was just ludicrous. I've got to watch my language. The people who say stuff like this need to learn to read and actually find out what's really going on, rather than listening to some of the rubbish that's sprouted out there, like we just heard.
So tell us, what is really going on? What is the root cause here?
Well, I think you can characterise the 2019-20 season as a climate-driven event. There's a torrent of scientific research coming out of the pipeline at the moment, and that unequivocally shows that this was a climatically driven phenomenon. So record-breaking drought, of unprecedented scale, a spatial scale, unrelenting fire weather, and most importantly, a whole bunch of lightning emissions that sort of capitalised on those, on the template of dryness across the landscape. We know from analysis that over 50% of the damage in terms of property, etc., was caused by fires that originated from lightning. So unless, people associated with the conservation movement can direct lightning, then you...
If only.
Yeah, that's right.
We'd be
you
thought.
can't draw that conclusion.
Yeah. And Leslie, you're an expert on climate change. Can you just dig a little deeper there into how climate is driving bushfire and maybe give us a bit of an idea of what we can expect in future fire seasons?
Well, I think if you think of fires as being the result of a recipe with just a few ingredients, obviously you need oxygen, but let's put that aside. You need something to light the fire, something that's the spark. And as Ross just said, we've had a lot more sparks because of lightning, and you actually get more lightning in a warmer atmosphere. So as the world continues to heat up, there'll be more lightning events, and there is data around the world to show that trend. Next, you need something to burn, and obviously things that are drier will burn more readily. And as these guys have just said, we've just had the driest year before the Black Summer bushfires, so the fuel was super dry, as was the soil, and as wind goes across the soil, the air is very dry as well. And then it's the weather on the day, and as Ross just said, and Greg, on those days of those fires, we had extraordinarily hot, dry, windy weather. And of course, as the world keeps heating up, we're getting more and more of those extreme hot days. So you put all that together, and it's really a no-brainer that bushfires seasons are getting longer, they're statistically getting longer, and they're getting more severe.
Yeah. And one of the other things that we heard a lot about during that fire season was hazard reduction burning. Just wondering, maybe Greg, you could tell us what is hazard reduction burning, and what place does it hold as climate change makes conditions around bushfire more severe?
Sure. Well, look, hazard reduction burning is one of the best tools that fire managers have had for 100 years, I suppose, but mainly since 1939, the bushfires in 1939, to manage and mitigate the risk of bushfires. So it means intentionally setting fires in known fire paths around settlements, some broad areas, so that fuels are reduced. And the theory is if there's less fuel, there's less fire intensity, and it might actually stop the fires. Now, the problems with climate change are fire seasons are becoming much longer. So in New South Wales, it's supposed to start in October, go till March. We've been routinely having bad fires start in August each year and sometimes go through to late April. So the fire seasons are getting longer. Those times when we would be burning, it's often too dangerous. The fires will get away from us. Or it rains and you can't burn. So the windows are getting smaller. And the other big issue that we saw in these last fires was that when the fire danger index gets too extreme and catastrophic, fires will burn through anything. So I was New Year's Eve at Bateman's Bay, and we had half-metre flames racing across people's lawns because they were baked brown by the drought and by the heat. And we had these extreme winds. We could hear thunder above with a pyroconvective storm, so fire-generated storm. But another fire I was at near Wombian Caves, I had to pull crews out. It had been hazard reduced 18 months before, and it was just bracken, fern and grass, but because of the weather conditions, it was too dangerous for the firefighters to stay there. And that's what's happening. So their biggest tool that firefighters have had for all those decades is becoming less and less effective. And look, I'm not saying we don't need to do hazard reduction, but we need to target it around assets and people and really think about how we use it, because there's not that many people able to get out there and do it.
Can you help us out a little bit with some of the terminology? Because one of the things I noticed is that particularly during the fire season, everybody's an expert in fire, and everybody wants to tell you how it should be handled, even though they've never...
Even a marine biologist become an expert in fire.
But let's just unpack some of the terms. So, what is backburning? What is hazard reduction burning?
Sure.
What are the different terms?
So as soon as you hear someone talking about we should be doing more backburning to stop the fires, you know that they haven't got a clue what they're talking about. So a backburn is when you have a bushfire and you say, here's a highway, we'll try and burn out the fuel in front of that fire that's coming towards us and make that fire go and meet it so it stops the fire. So that's a backburn. It's a firefighting tactic or strategy.
The word back literally means burning back against the wind, because the approaching fire is being driven by the wind, so you're actually lighting a fire hoping it will back into the wind.
That's right, and that's what my dad used to say, well, burn back, we'll go and burn back to stop this fire and backburn. And a hazard reduction burn is a planned operation where they'll say, look, we need to burn around Hornsby Heights and get a buffer between the homes and the valley because fires come that way, so we'll burn out a big buffer and try and modify the fuels. So they're planned operations.
It's worth saying hazard reduction or fuel reduction burning is like a subset of a broader term called prescribed burning, literally burning to a prescription. So in the case of hazard reduction, you're trying to reduce and change the structure of fuel. But you may also have another type of burning under the bucket of prescribed burning, for example, to stimulate certain species or to change habitat conditions. So it's best to see, prescribed burning, as Greg said, as a catch-all term for planned burning. And one of those reasons for planning a burn is to, reduce and change fuel, hazard reduction. Fuel being hazard.
At the conference in a couple of weeks' time, we'll hear some speakers who are First Nations people. There's been a lot of talk about Indigenous involvement in fire, and here at the Nature Conservation Council, we were involved in setting up the Fire Sticks program and sort of got a long history of that. Can you talk to us a little bit about what, I guess, the existing fire management regime has already learned from our Indigenous brothers and sisters, and what is yet to be learned?
Look, to be honest, we haven't learned a great deal because we haven't listened, and I think that's a 200-year problem, but not a recent one. So a lot of people who live in the landscape and know how to manage the landscape have found it very difficult to work with government agencies, for example, and to get approval to do burns. So, but what they're about is healing country, and and I don't understand it because I don't live in the bush, but it's about people who are deeply connected to the wildlife, the the vegetation, the weather patterns and how things should be. And they're different types of burning, and I don't think I'm qualified. I'm certainly not qualified to actually talk about that, but it certainly has a role. The problem in Sydney, for example, is that over those 200 years, the original inhabitants have been driven out, so a lot of that traditional knowledge has gone. However, Bundjalung people from Northern Rivers, for example, and people from the South Coast are bringing that knowledge back and spreading it and trying different things, and that needs to be supported. There needs to be a lot more mild burning out in the landscape.
Yeah, and just some of the things that have come up there around like the struggle with hazard reduction burning and the sort of difficulty of managing that with worsening climate change. Just interested to hear, how do we manage those risks going forward as we know that it is going to continue, under business as usual. Climate change isn't getting any better anytime soon. How do we manage the risk of fire? And I suppose, the bigger question there is, what do you say when you sit down with the Minister for the Environment or the Minister for Emergency Services? What do we need to be seeing? How do we manage this ever-increasing risk, and what do we want to see?
I would summarise it by saying we've got to get smarter, because in the end, a lot of discussion and what masquerades as debate about fire management is fantasy, because it doesn't take into account the reality, the very cold hard reality of resources and money. Fire management is expensive. So resources and budgets are not unlimited, they're just not ever expanding. So we are faced, as Greg has alluded to, the effectiveness of hazard reduction, for example, and even other types of fire management, various suppression operations, are contingent upon the circumstances, the weather conditions at the time. So if those weather conditions are going to deteriorate in the future, or extreme weather will become more common, etc., it means that we're going to be really struggling to get even our current value for money. So we've got to get smarter. So we need to look more carefully at why we're doing things, where we're doing things, and ask the question, are we spending our money in the most cost-effective way?
Yeah.
Now, I know economics and all that sounds very good, but it ultimately is the key. I think the other thing too is, if you look at the 19-25 season, we're now almost a year and a half out of it. There's been the usual cycle of inquiry, recommendations, government responses. What's really changed? Not much. But things like cultural burning are really interesting, because to me they're an expression from the grassroots. So you've got, one element in society, very disadvantaged people, expressing themselves. Cultural burning, at least at one level, is a renewal process. It's an affirmation of ancient traditions. The same thing even with non-Aboriginal people, but living out in the bush, a greater impetus to self-organise, not just to rely on top-down government approaches. So, there's no magic answers. We've got to get smarter, we've got to spend our money in the most effective way, but we've also perhaps got to encourage more of a grassroots response for people to take some of the problem and educate themselves about risks and figure out how they can, literally get their own backyards into shape.
Managed, yeah. And what about managing the climate risk? Leslie, I know it might seem obvious, but, it's not happening. What would you like to see there?
Well, we've got to do two things. Of course, we've got to cope with and adapt to the changing circumstances, and I think just as some people living in coastal properties are going to have to retreat away from the coast, with rising sea level and increased levels of storm surge damage, just as people living on floodplains, are not going to be able to live there during the sort of floods that we saw here in the last couple of weeks. And there will be places in our environment, some of those urban bushland interfaces, which are just not going to be tenable in the future, because people are not going to be able to insure their houses in the future. And once you can't insure an asset, the asset becomes worthless, and most people's assets are mostly tied up in their properties. So we will be looking in the future decades, at a readjustment of where and how people live, unfortunately. But that's the sort of the immediate thing, and in between, all the sorts of things that Greg and Ross have been talking about be really important, plus different sorts of planning regulations, different sorts of building codes to increase resilience, different sorts of community organisations and early warning systems and evacuation plans and better resourcing for our firefighting services. All of that's going to be really important. But look, ultimately, unless we get the climate under control, all of that is a temporary response. Yeah. And ultimately, we've got to fix the climate problem.
Yeah.
One of the things that a lot of people were saying during those fires a couple of years ago was, well, we've always had bushfires. Sydney, Australia, is a country where bushfires is part of the experience of living here. This is something we've got to be used for. And certainly, growing up, we all kind of remember bad bushfire seasons that have happened from time to time, as indeed farmers have experienced drought over times and floods and all of that over time. But one of the things that really struck me during the fires, I live in suburban Sydney, and right here in the middle of town, you'd know that the air was unbreathable, really, like in the middle of Sydney. I think Bob Carr wrote an op-ed at the time that said, had Sydney been bidding for the Olympic Games now, we would never get them, because we wouldn't have been able to guarantee athlete safety in that way. I mean, is this the new normal? Is this what we've got to start to get used to? Fires of this kind of magnitude. Even people who live nowhere near the bush, having to expect that every year or two we might find ourselves literally unable to keep our kids safe from the air.
Well, I mean, 8 million people were affected by those Black Summer bushfires. So, it's about a third of the population of the entire country. It was unprecedented from that perspective, and a lot of people lost their lives directly in the bushfires, but also there was over 400 people estimated to have had shortened lives because of that impact. So, yes, we've always had fires. We've never had fires like that, and I think we have to get used to fires like that happening more frequently and be prepared accordingly.
And Greg, you mentioned that you've been fighting fires for 50 years. Thinking to the future, but also thinking back, what have you seen in that time?
So, look, I grew up watching Dad fight fires. I grew up in Terry Hills with Kringai Chase, on the edge of Kringai Chase National Park, and Dad was a volunteer. So I started fighting fires when I was 12, so I'm not that old. But and I'm off doing a hazard reduction burn tomorrow with the RFS. But they were predictable, and bad fire season, so the bad fire weather came about once every 10 or 11 years in the Blue Mountains and the Sydney Basin, and the old timers could pick it. The 1994 fires, to me, and I don't know scientifically if that's true, but something changed, because November it rained and we thought we're fine now, and then it just got hot and stayed hot, and there were fires burning up in Grafton, which is pretty normal because the fires moved south. And then we just got smashed. We just had days and days on end of bad fire weather, and the old timers and Dad shook their head and said, we never saw this coming. Then instead of 10 years apart, we were burning 97, 2001, 2002, 2003, a fire tornado ripped through Canberra, 485 homes. 2006, the Blue Mountains, pyroconvective storm. 2009, Black Saturday. 2013, in October. Now, major property loss in New South Wales in the past had happened late November to January, and this was early October, and there was no El Nino, and that got everyone's attention. So I've probably lost track of your question, but it's just become worse and worse and worse. And we even had to change the fire danger index after 2009 because it's a scale of 1 to 100, and it kept going over 100, which previously was theoretically impossible. But those bloody computers keep calculating, and so now that's catastrophic. We used to say, don't evacuate, you don't need to, but now we say, on those days, get out, because even the firefighters will be getting out. So it's just, and look, the last thing, the real indicator to me was from 78 to 2018, the satellite record, I believe, Ross might, and Leslie might correct me, but 60 pyroconvective storms, so fire-generated storms over that one summer, 29. So, an average of about 2 a year, and suddenly you get 29. Things that most firefighters had never, ever seen. Now we've all seen them.
And that's where we hear that word, unprecedented.
Yeah, and that's warming.
Yeah, and I would answer your question by pointing out some of the environmental and conservation consequences. Yeah, we've always had fires in the past. Many of our forests, for example, are superbly adapted to handle fire, even regular fire, high intensity fire, low intensity fire. So, if you look at the scientific literature, even a high intensity fire will only usually kill about 5% of the trees in a eucalypt forest, in a typical re-sprouting eucalypt forest. Because of the drought and the fire and the intensity of the fires, we are seeing instances just starting to emerge now, through survey work, of much higher mortality. So it's not just the fire, it's also the drought. So when you stack these things on top of each other, we are pushing what are normally regarded as highly resilient and biodiverse ecosystems, possibly towards the edge of a cliff. And some of the areas, that have been very severely burnt are slow to recover, even despite the rainfall since the fires. Imagine if we are going to have another event like that fairly soon in the future. So suddenly we might reach, that metaphorical cliff, and that is of huge concern. So yeah, we've had fires in the past, but when you start having fires of this magnitude, this intensity, and also that drought, you've got to look at these multiple combinations of things, which are all manifestations ultimately, of what we're concerned about.
And Ross, you mentioned the sort of economics and the cost of, managing fire, and Leslie, you mentioned about insurance and properties becoming uninsurable. We're not seeing action from, the federal government on climate change. Like, where to from here? Is it the sort of finance industry, or what? Who's going to show some leadership on this?
Well, I think there's lots of leadership being shown in all sectors of the community except the federal government. So we're seeing, a great action in community groups. We are seeing some really amazing action in the business community. We're seeing wonderful action in local and also state governments. I mean, all our state and territory governments at least have net zero targets. In fact, the Biden Climate Summit, which is happening tonight, it was expected. The word on the street was the government would announce a net zero target. That looks very unlikely now. So they're not even announcing that. They're throwing a bit of money at some technology which is mostly unproven, hydrogen hubs that will possibly be mostly powered by fossil fuels. So the federal government is completely, I think, out of step with the concern and the action of the rest of Australia.
Yeah.
We are seeing the beginning of a reaction through the insurance industry. So previously, insurance for property really wasn't weighted to reflect the risk from fires, but that's starting to change.
Yeah.
So it will probably evolve much more to, be similar to the model with floods, and that just simply reflects the exposure of those companies. They're in business to make a profit, so they're not going to give away insurance on vulnerable property that's at high risk. So that will be one of the drivers, I suspect, down the track. As Leslie says, it might result in the retreat, from flammable landscapes.
Yeah.
Look, I'm a firefighter, but I read a lot, and you see business moving, but the fundamental issue is if you haven't got a policy framework and certainty for business, they don't know what to do. Now, I'd like to buy an electric vehicle, but I can't afford one unless I get one from Tassie they get from Japan, but so I've looked into that. Just about every country in the world has incentives, sales tax incentives, etc., to bring in electric vehicles. They're putting in charging points. Not here. And so there's practical things this government could do. Yet we hear our Prime Minister say, I'm not announcing a target until I know how. Well, whose job is it to work out how? Surely the people we elect and pay as our servants, they think they're our masters, that we can vote them out, folks. Surely it's their job to come up with that roadmap. Every other country can do it. Are we too dumb in Australia? I don't think so.
Yeah.
Business, the community want action.
Imagine having that attitude to COVID.
Well,
Similar
she'll be right.
threat.
I'm old enough to remember when John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States, said we are going to the moon in a decade. My God, that was the greatest technological and scientific challenge and a target that one could ever conjure up.
We know how to do it.
And they did
the
it.
will that's missing.
And
That's
I think the COVID example in the climate change context is really useful because, Australia did well. We still we're here sitting less than
Shoulder to
1.5
shoulder.
metres apart because the Australian government actually handled COVID very well. Not perfectly
We listened
with
to the
vaccine.
science.
We did three things. They listened to the science. They listened. They used the advice of the experts. They acted early, closing the borders, and they prioritised that threat over everything else.
Yeah.
And that's what we should have been doing with climate all along. We could do it now, but for some reason they're acting on the expert advice on COVID, but not on climate.
Yeah, that's right. I hope we've answered some of the burning questions that people had tonight about bushfire. I feel like I know a lot more than I did beforehand, so thank you so much to our panellists. But I feel like we really did just scratch the surface. This is obviously such a huge issue, and there is so much more to discuss on climate change and bushfire management and how we're going to continue to manage bushfire into the future. If people do want to know more and have more questions for our wonderful panellists, I would encourage everybody to register for the Ncc Bushfire Conference, which is happening online on the 4th, 5th and 6th of May, where Leslie, Ross and Greg will be joining us. You've just distracted me with the t-shirt.
Sorry.
But we do have a shop. We have an online shop at shop.nature.org.au where you can buy a wonderful Koalas Need Trees t-shirt. There are many reasons to protect trees from bushfire. Obviously, protecting habitat is just one of those reasons. But please do jump along and register for the conference, because it'll be a great opportunity to dive deeper into some of these really important issues.
Thank you all so much for being with us tonight, and thanks everybody who's watching at home for joining us. Remember that these episodes are available online, so you can go to our website and check them out, or have a look at YouTube, which is Nature Conservation Council YouTube page, and the NCC Facebook page as well, so you can catch up on the episodes at any time. We've done probably close to 15 of them now, and they're all worth a watch. It's also a podcast, so you can, wherever you get your podcasts from, you'll be able to hear these episodes just as a podcast. Not quite as nice as being able to see us in the flesh.
And it's much easier to search for than cocktails, controversy and conservation, because all you have to remember is Voices for Nature.
It's called Voices for Nature. Now, when this call finishes in a moment, you're going to get redirected, as usual, to our donations page. Koalas grow on trees, but money does not. And the only way that we can keep doing the work that we do across the whole NCC, all of the work on the various campaigns we do, climate, fire, forests, water, koalas, all the issues that come up, is because of the generous donations that people like you can offer up. So if you can spare a few bucks, I know times are always tight, but if you can spare a few bucks, it does make a huge difference. And thank you to everybody who each time we have one of these episodes chips in. It certainly is making quite a big difference to our ability to keep doing this work. Thanks so much for joining us.